pinged Monik, but I feel like I did a little bit too late. I think that's. We are behind the blue wall.
Okay, I'm good to go.
All right. That case, we will. Fine. We will go out from behind the blue wall. Hello, welcome to Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about The Matrix. But before we do that, Buddy, why don't you let folks know what it is we do on this podcast?
Well, on this podcast, we talk about movies. Mostly, I think we've done more movies episodes this year than games episodes. Though we are some Derps Talk About Games. So it is Matrix month. We are approaching very swiftly the release of The Matrix 4, The Matrix Resurrections at the end of December. So we are going, and in keeping with our you know, what would I call these? These are sort of like landmark episodes, right? Like this is a landmark episode on The Matrix in the same way that we had landmark episodes on like Star Wars and stuff like that, right? So yes, so we'll be talking about The Matrix. Today is the Matrix 1, and then over the next couple of weeks we'll be doing The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolution. So yeah.
All right. Yeah. So I guess pre-spoiler review of The Matrix. What are your thoughts? And we're going to be spoiling all 3 Matrix movies at various times throughout these reviews. So, you know,
if you need a spoiler for a 22-year-old movie, I suppose, yeah. Right? God, what is my pre-spoiler review for The Matrix? Like, this thing is a masterpiece. And I say that in a sort of straightforward way. Like, I think we all understand, like, The Matrix is good. And The Matrix has always been incredibly good, right? Like, this is the movie that maybe defined 5 years straight of like action filmmaking, it felt like. Not to mention that I think it also sort of opened the world to these sort of more fantastical and metaphorical you know, sorts of movies that we would eventually get all throughout the mid 2000s, right? Like something that I think The Matrix is a definitive kind of like starting point of is it's there with X-Men, and like Lord of the Rings would be 2 years later, but is also part of this, right? Like the big real shift kind of away from straightforward, you know, sort of action dramas, like disaster movies, right? Like this was the big thing in the 90s, disaster movies, into the really high concept sci-fi superhero stuff, fantasy stuff, right? I think all of that stuff kind of comes, and The Matrix is absolutely riding that wave, right? Everybody wants to point to one specific movie. You know, you want to point to X-Men or Blade, or you want to point to Lord of the Rings. And I think that I've probably done this on this podcast, right? But I think that they all kind of coalesce together, and these are like the changing of the seasons in motion. And yeah, and The Matrix itself is just like an incredibly well-crafted film. It is probably one of the best, like, tightest scripts I think I've ever read and seen put to screen. You know, like one of the things that I did a lot when I was in college was I had to like I had to read screenplays. And the Matrix screenplay was great. It was incredibly tight. Actually, funnily enough, the best screenplay I think I ever read was Brokeback Mountain, but maybe The Matrix is like number 2 or number 3 in that list. It's just like it has all of the momentum and all of the kind of like stakes and drama that are incredibly absorbing. I guess I just want to say that. But I do also want to add that I think The Matrix is a little basic. This is the downside of The Matrix. I think The Matrix is a little basic. And I guess we'll talk about the implications of that later on. That's like a
Okay.
spoiler for some stuff that I want to bring up later.
Interesting, because I think the what you might be picking up on it. Obviously, we'll get into this later. Is if you go back and watch it now, especially if you've never watched it, like it's almost like imagine like reading like a large portion of the Western canon and not being aware of the Bible, what the Bible was, and then going and reading the Bible and being like, oh, right, like I felt like that a lot with this movie, right?
Yeah.
That, like, or like something similar like the Seinfeld effect, right? Like where you can clearly see how things from this movie influence stuff to this day, right? Like it has influenced a large generation of things, and how like things that feel like weird and different, like there are points I looked at this and were like, this isn't this has some like like some weaknesses that maybe I can pick out, but like it all kind of like disappears in the background. I also wonder if just as kind of as part of this, right? Like we talk about like nitpicky bullshit a lot. If like there's a bunch of nitpicky bullshit in this that like kind of like bubbles up in my head that I don't really care about on like an object level, and also gets explained away in the third movie because it kind of has like we can talk about that when we get there in 2 weeks, but like that kind of like, oh, this is all part of the plan anyway, like lets you retrospectively get away with a lot of weird little plot holes, but uh I think regardless of all of that, it works. It's great. I will agree with you. I also think that like a lot of like the some of the stuff comes off as like cheesy is the best way to put it, but I think that a lot of that's kind of like because it's breaking new ground, it doesn't feel old and tired. Like it's like they're like something that like really stuck out at me was kind of like it's not super early CG, but it's early enough that you can like see the edges on things, and you can like see where.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the CG has not held up very well. It has there are a couple of particular moments like when Neo touches the glass or whatever and the glass gets on his fingers. That I think at the time looked great, but now looks awful and so bad, right?
Yeah, I mean,
just because like it's a really tough thing to render.
Reflections are super fucking hard, right? And super intensive, right? And like you can even see like you can first of all, I wonder how much of this is just like, resolution got better and so it's easier to see these things, right? But the little bug they put in his stomach, if you look at like I was staring at it and it's CG, but the tail when it's like wiggling around in his belly button, that's like a practical effect. You can like see it shift between the two scenes. Like that like it clearly goes from like a CG thing to like a practical effect. And the practical effect obviously holds up a bit better. But I think part of this is just kind of like I said, like upresing as you walk forward, right? Like the scene in, I guess we're I guess post spoiler territory, whatever, right?
Okay,
like,
yeah, sure.
The scene where Morpheus and Neo are hanging from the helicopter, right? You can watch it go between a top down view over a green screen and like the cities inserted in the background, and like was clearly some very impressive crane work of some sort, right? Like you don't need to watch it more than once to see those things from like a modern eye. I just wonder, if you went back,
that stunt absolutely looks real, right?
Yeah.
Like in the sense that I believe that's really, Keanu Reeves and Lawrence Fishburne. But it is unreal in the sense that it is not taking place. It is taking place on a soundstage, right? It is not taking place on, a real skyscraper and a real helicopter, obviously.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Though I will say one thing I forgot about this movie is how much they do show the actors' fate. Like it is just the actors sitting there doing their fight choreography. That's something I kind of forgot about. And I loved, like I honestly loved every second of just these incredibly highly choreographed, right? Like kind of like punch for punch, sort of tit for tat, right? Like kung fu fights. I don't know why, because I think I would on aggregate say that that's kind of bad filmmaking, right? Like the camera is not very dynamic. It's just holding on this medium shot. You're just watching them do these punches and they're so artificial. There's no way that those are real, like this is not real combat.
Right.
And it doesn't give me the sense that it's real combat, but it does give me the sense that like it is two people in legitimate conflict, if that makes sense. So it is unreal combat, I guess, is what I'm saying. And I kind of forgot how nice that looks, right? Like in a world where it just feels like a lot of action is kind of obsessed with being very realistic, to see something that is not, that is stylistic and
Yeah.
choreographed to an immaculate degree is kind of special. It's like it's a little bit of like a palate cleanser, compared to something like, I mean, John Wick is maybe the best,
Well, I was gonna
easiest
say that, like,
example.
I think John Wick starts the trend of like doing hyper realistic combat, right? Because
Yeah.
like Matrix is very clearly wuxia, right? Watchmen, the movie, is
Hmm.
very clearly supposed to be wuxia instead of like real action. But like, I mean, wuxia is a long enough running kind of like filmic tradition that there's obviously some tricks there to like make it like to capture like the cinematic combat element of it, right? Like, and still make it work. But I agree with you. I think is in kind of the larger strokes. It did look very fake, but that didn't like. I don't think that detracts from it. The only thing that really bothered me about the fight scenes is the effect that they use to make like the punching look fast. Never looked good to me. Like never looked good to me. Right? Like there's like where
Okay.
it's just kind of like double. It is like a very small thing, but like they like it's kind of like do like a an after fade effect on the punches, right? Like it so it looks. It's supposed to be it's going really fast, but it just looked dumb to me. But that's a particular thing for me, I guess maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I do have some problems with some of the fight scenes. Like, so for instance, and I think that this is a problem kind of endemic to all of the Matrix films, which is that the fight scenes are sometimes sort of devoid of like stakes or meaning in the story and the plot. And granted, the Matrix 1 is the best about this, right? I think it has the most fight scenes that like matter in terms of the outcome of who wins and who loses is important, right? Um but I remember thinking that the one and it's like the famous one too, like when they go through the metal detector and they're just like gunning down the security guards or whatever, right? I remember thinking how superfluous that was. And I was just like, that this would be cut in a modern movie, because people would notice this and just kind of go, this doesn't matter. We know the heroes are better than these guys, than these random mooks, and we don't need to like lavishly film them shooting a bunch of red shirts, right? What really matter are their, is their confrontation with the agents, right? Like those are the real threats, right? Um, and and that's something that I think is maybe a little problematic going forward, because I remember this also being a problem in Reloaded and Revolutions, like even more so. But it's just like there are sometimes this sort of like gratuitous, the Morpheus Neo fight scene where they're first doing kung fu together or whatever. It's also a little bit like this, right? Like it's a little almost like indulgent, I guess is kind of the word I'm looking for.
So I get what you're saying about the business like elevator like the thing that the lobby scene, right?
Mm,
Um, I think I might even largely agree with you there, but I think the Morpheus Neo scene is important kind of like established like it's doing a lot of work with world building in a couple of
yeah.
ways, right? Like it's establishing like this place. It kind of like is the moment where you like really get to see like things break from like you know a person acting perfectly because they've gotten the program uploaded into their head do something that breaks what would be possible in reality, right? Like that's where you get like into like I'm gonna call true wuxia territory.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other part of this is this kind of like this thing that I think is that I realized was like a little bit hard to appreciate. Um, in in the rear view, which is that like the movie tries to hold as an open question for a very long time whether or not Neo is actually the one,
Yeah.
right? Like, and that scene plays into it, right? Because that's like a point in his favor. It's immediately followed up by the jump scene, which he fails, right? Like everyone fails, and so and that kind of like is a point in the other direction, and then you very quickly move into the Oracle scene, which is where we're told that he's not the one, right? Uh, but I think that it does important kind of like stage setting there. But I feel like the lobby scene was just like a cool scene to have in an action movie type of deal. But I like that scene less so. But like the fact that they like blow out the bottom of the elevator, I'm like, what? Why did they do that? Like, what was just to get the agent's attention? Maybe.
Yeah, I don't really understand a lot of
This
the
is the type of
mechanics
like
there either.
this is a lot of the kind of like a lot of like the like nitpicky-ish bullshit that's like it's like oh whatever, right? Like
Yeah,
I'll
I
put it
mean,
away.
it's one of those things where if you think about the agents, just like for instance, okay, so one of the things we talked about in Free Guy is that the GMs in the world wouldn't be spawning Uzis for themselves. They would just be pointing and killing the character or whatever. And that was something that I wasn't expecting my brain to go to,
My brain
but
went
it
there
was
too.
just,
Yeah,
yeah, I was just like, my first immediate thought is just like, man, how come the agents can't just fucking delete these guys? Like, why would you have an agent that can shoot a gun, but you don't give him perfect pinpoint accuracy, right? Like if I can write an aimbot script for Call of Duty or whatever, you would think that the Matrix, the machines would be able to write a script for their agents to always hit with their, with their handguns. There was just like a lot of that in in sort of the scenes that nobody ever remembers, right? Where it's like, oh, like I forgot about this like chase scene. Like in my head, the scene in the subway takes place at the exact same point or within the exact same location, right? That the scene at the end with the hallway. But there's actually this whole chase where he's running through the crowd and the agents are following him, right? And I remember thinking like the agents are shooting at him, and I'm just like, how are the agents missing? How are the agents like stormtrooper bad when it comes to this? And I think the answer is just don't think about it, right? Like this is the
yeah.
kind of thing
Oh
that's just
yeah.
gonna unravel the entire fucking movie
No,
if you.
I was gonna say I definitely had a moment where I was like, how do they not have a way to like boot people from the Matrix, right? Like and like I don't know. I went through like a series of these in my head because like they paper over his mouth in that opening scene, right? And that just like
Mhm.
opens up like a ton of fucking questions, right? It's like
Yeah.
like why don't they just do like something like that all the time, right? Like and like even the idea that like they have to find people rather than being able to, but that's like you said, that's and as Lou says in the chat, right? Like it makes for a tree story. You can slash kill your way through everything. And honestly, I would have liked like this is the type of thing you get into in like external literature, right? Like in like
Mhm.
the official
Yeah,
guidebooks of the
yeah.
Matrix.
This is the kind of thing that I want to read in a book somewhere where they're like, oh, actually, there's so much stuff, there's so much data coming into and out of and flowing through the matrix that it's impossible for the machines to track this. And so that's why you can hide in plain sight as a like I'm sure honestly, like in Enter the Matrix or the Animatrix or something, I would not be surprised if there was some answer to
I
this
mean,
like fundamental concept in there.
again, the answer, the get a jail free card is that like this was designed to happen because it like this like the revelation by the architect, and I forget if it's the second or the third movie.
It's in the second movie, yeah.
Yeah, is that like this is all part of the grand plan, and so like that kind of like lets you like write off literally any plot hole about like why they should be able to do anything. It's like well they let them do
Yeah,
it.
something that I remember not thinking about at all, but is so obvious to me now, is that the Oracle is a program. I remember this was such a huge fucking deal. No one, I mean, partially, I was 10.
Yeah,
We were 10, 11, 12 at the time. No one was thinking on this kind of level. I'm sure if I was a 20-year-old guy in college watching The Matrix, I would be having a more complex thought about this. But at the time, when The Matrix Reloaded came out and it was revealed that the Oracle was a program of the machines that was helping people, that was mind blowing to me at the time because you just don't think about it, right? Who is the Oracle? I don't know. Why are they doing what they're doing? Not explained, but you don't care about it. You're just with it. You're just kind of moving through the pieces. But the moment that question gets answered in the second one, I just like, it was like kaboom, my whole fucking head exploded and I couldn't believe it. I actually was surprised to see, by the way, one of the things that you hear about when it comes to the Matrix and the Matrix Reloaded and Revolutions is that, like, the Matrix, they put everything in it because they thought it was going to be one and done, right? It was a Star Wars story, right? They got a bunch of money kind of out of nowhere. The only other movie they had made before this was like a lesbian, romantic drama or something, right? That was like an independent, like Oscar, an Oscar kind of bait movie, right? And so they went like really hard for like this. They went really hard for the Matrix, and I was kind of expecting to see kind of more cracks, like more seams between it and Reloaded and Revolutions, right? Since those two were like not planned essentially. But I was actually surprised that the opposite was the case. I felt like I was constantly seeing things that were like jolting me forward and being like, oh, this pays off later. Oh, that pays off later, right? Like in Reloaded, in Revolutions, right? And it's stuff like that actually makes me think like the Matrix is like secretly like, this is I think this is part of the Matrix's like secret sauce. Is that it is that sort of expansive. It has that, it does not feel contained. It feels open. There's this huge other world to go explore and like learn more about.
Yeah, it's kind of got that John Wick thing going for it, where like a lot of the greater world is hinted at, but not explicitly spoken to. So there's like room to build in it, um, and and so I think that like lends it to to that level of like creativity. Although something I will note is something that just like stuck out at me like a sore thumb was in the Hellscape version of the future that or that Morpheus brings him to, the Twin Towers are standing, burned out, but it's like, oh well, there's that, right? Like, as
Mhm.
it's just like one of those things that you can't help but like see, or at least for me it was that way.
Yeah.
Uh, but just to your Star Wars point, I was actually weirdly surprised by like the number of parallels. Like, Neo is a chosen one who is supposed to be too old for like becoming the chosen one, right? Like he's discovered too late, like later than normal. Um, there's also the thing that brought this to my mind is like when at one point he says like that's not true, like something very close to like that's not true, that's not possible, and it's very close to that isn't true, that's like it just like stuck out in my head. It's like they're not like super huge things, but they're like obviously they're built on kind of the same model of story, right? Chosen one,
Mhm.
fantastic world type of deal, rejects
Yeah, I mean,
all
and
that.
even the nature of Neo's chosen one-ness is kind of is very like complicated. There's a lot going on there, right? I think the other chosen one narrative that does this, and it's weird for me to say this as a positive thing, is Harry Potter, which is also a little bit of almost like a deconstruction. I feel like a lot of Neo's being a chosen one is a deconstruction of the nature of being chosen one. Deconstruction is kind of the wrong term for it, but it has sort of more complex machinery in place than just he is he is the one, right? Part of this though I think only comes out in Reloaded and Revolutions, right? Like my read on Neo as chosen one, and I don't know if this matches you, right? But Neo is not the chosen one when he talks to the Oracle. Neo becomes the chosen one when Trinity falls in love with him and brings him back to life. In a sense, she chooses him to be the chosen one, right? And what the Oracle says is, you have the gift, but you're not quite there or whatever, right? Like that is the indication that the Oracle, right, sees that there is the possibility that Neo could be the chosen one, but he hasn't transformed. And the transformative moment comes when Trinity, who has been prophesied to fall in love with the chosen one, right, uh brings him back to life after he's shot by Agent Smith. Like that's the moment where he becomes it, right? Which is supported in the later movies because we later learn that the nature of the chosen one and Zion and all of this is to collectivize the problem of free will, right? That humans reject the matrix when there isn't an outlet for free will to be exercised, right? And that outlet is Zion, that outlet is the one. um and so we know that there's free will in the matrix, and we know that everyone who is fighting against the machines is exercising their free will. So yes, theoretically Trinity does have the free will to choose who the chosen one is, as and the Oracle knows that she has that ability and communicates that to her. And it's like all of that is way more chosen one stuff than you ever get out of like a typical narrative. Do you know what I mean?
I know
Like
what
just
you mean.
because it's
I don't know if I totally agree, because like I don't know if there's like a I don't know if there's like I don't know if I agree with your reading on like, Trinity can choose who she loves, because like I think that that's what does the Oracle say? The Oracle says something along the lines of like you you know it when you're there type of deal, right? Like I get what you're saying. That is interesting though. That's an interesting thing, not one that I hadn't thought of. I thought that was just kind of
and by the way, that is only one reading. Like the other reading, and I think this is the more common one, though I don't like it as much because I think it's less true, is that Neo is not the one when he talks to the Oracle, but he self-actualize, like that he realizes and is able to, manifest essentially, and that any of the kids in there could have manifested as being the one if placed in the right conditions and under the right circumstances. A lot of times people, like when people say that, they tend to link it to Neo's decision to stand and fight Smith in the subway tunnel, as the first person to sort of break with the protocol of even just running from the agents, right? Like he is willing to face down an agent and 1v1 an agent. Like that's the thing that kind of breaks him out of normality and lets him ascend to be the chosen one. And then the other one, and this one I like the least just because I think it is the least true and most clickbaity, is that Neo is not the one. The one is actually Agent Smith. And that this only comes up later in Reloaded and Revolutions because Smith is the person who can most directly break and influence, the Matrix via copying himself a million times, as we've all seen. I think that one is the least supported and least interesting, but it is like it's the one that like a Watch Mojo movie will make a fucking dumb fan theory video on and get 2 million views on YouTube.
I'm surprised that none of those are she was just lying to him. He was always the one. Because like that's
there is always that, like there is
that's
always
like
that.
the plainest. Morpheus, tells him she told you what you needed to hear, not necessarily what was true.
Yeah.
But so let me hit you with something, because I wanted to bring this up at some point anyway, right? That scene is also where we get like probably like there's obviously a lot of like mixing of like I'm gonna call it generally Eastern philosophy with like Western religion. Just because I don't have the strongest grip on say like Buddhism or any of the Zen traditions, but there's clearly that influence there, right? Like the line where the kid says, realize there is no spoon. Something along the lines of like, when you bend yourself, right? Like that is a very Zen line. That's like something like I went and looked to see if I could find it, because it sounds like something I might have heard Alan Watts say or something, right? Like, or like a like a interpretation of something like that. And so the idea of the one being, the person that can achieve, what I guess something along the lines of like true ego death, right? Like, becoming one with everything, right? Like, which is kind of like like that's like the old freaking joke, right? Like, Dalai Lama goes to a hot dog vendor and says, "Make me one with everything," right? Like that kind of like philosophic root, I think might be operative there, if that makes sense, right? Like Neo,
that's interesting.
Go on.
My core take is that the philosophy isn't super Eastern and that it is in fact pretty Western, because I think the bedrock of the Matrix is Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard, right?
Which is that he has,
which is the book. It's the book that Neo shows. It's also where the quote, "The desert of the real," comes from, because the idea of simulacra and simulation, right? Like a simulacra, I think he defines it in that book. It's like a copy there is no real right? There's nothing real, but it is copied. It is a copy of a copy of a copy, and eventually the original thing is so lost and gone that the only things left are the copies of copies, right? That there is no real anymore. There is just simulacra, right? And simulation. It's a one sentence thing. Obviously, it is deeper and more complicated than that, or whatever. That's like the thing. And the desert of the real is the desert, the desolation. There is no real. Like there is no real anymore. Real is so far from view because of the copies and copies that have been reintroduced over and over and over again, that it just simply doesn't exist anymore, right? That it is a desolate place that no one ever ventures to anymore, right? But I guess I do think that there is some sort of like, I agree, especially with the spoon, when he says like the secret is there is no spoon, right? Like that to me does hit me a kind of a like a Zen, or like almost like a Taoist
That
sort
is
of
super like
yeah.
I think part of it is that like there's obviously like a collision of a lot of things, right? Like obviously simulacra simulation is there. It's like literally in the fucking movie, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
that line is very zen. There's the very kind of Christian imagery of the one rising from the dead, right? Like and maybe that's an attempt to kind of like universalize a lot of these things, right? Like the one is supposed to be a reincarnation of a of a previous person. There's a lot of little stuff there too, like you they're like a line that hit me as being weirdly like a narco libertarian is when he's talking about so first of all, the matrix is all around you, and it's everywhere, right? Like that's one kind of like conjures like image, like that sounds a lot like a Holy Spirit line, right?
Mm.
Then but like in describing this fake thing, he says it's there when you go to church and when you pay your taxes, which is like that just kind of like pinged my like, oh, this is like pre-Reddit atheist libertarian like type of line right there, right? Like
Yeah, I mean, and this is sort of what what I alluded to is that the Matrix is a little bit basic. This is sort of where the Matrix, I think, stumbles a little bit for me, which is that it's simultaneously like deep and shallow, if that makes sense, right? Because I do think that examining these like copies of copies, right? That if you create a world that is so lifelike that people don't even know the difference, right? Like at what point is that just reality, right? Like that, like that's another thing that in simulacra and simulation, Judge Baudrillard talks about how if you're a cartographer, right, and you're drawing a map, and you draw a map that is so detailed as to have literally every detail of the place that you are mapping, at a certain point, the map ceases to be, and you are then just copying reality, right? You are making a completely one for one verisimilitudinous copy, right? Um, and I think that's crazy and that's compelling. And I love the way that Cypher honestly is like secretly my favorite character in this movie, just because I love his whole thing and his interaction, and I love the way that the guy plays him. I don't know who the fuck this guy is. He's Ralph Cifaretto in The Sopranos, but I just kind of have he's only in the first one, so like he just sort of disappeared out of my mind, and I was like, fuck, dude, I forgot how awesome this guy is, right? And I think that stuff is really deep, right? I think the greater stuff about the machines and the structure and the sort of the nature of the prison that is described as the Matrix and being slaves or whatever else. I think all of that is really basic and sort of uninteresting. And I think it's the genesis of where you get problems with the metaphor of the red pill, right? Because that represents politically a variety of different things, because it represents, breaking through and seeing some truth that the system doesn't want you to see. But that's such a vague statement that the system can be fucking anything, right? The system can be, you know, the church, it can be your parents, it can be school, it can be the government, it can be, ideological, right? And so that just opens it up to sort of be taken, like anybody could kind of claim anything to it, right? Obviously, white nationalists or men's rights activists could use the red pill in the way that it's been, like actually used. But then you also have people who make the entire opposite argument, right? That like, oh, the Matrix is this great work of anti-capitalist literature, and the Matrix is capitalism or whatever. And the truth is they're all correct because it's also vague that it'll fit
Yeah.
everything, right? It really has no point of view. And it sort of has no underwriting ideology. Which I don't think is bad in and of itself. It is just sort of the basic nature of the
I
the
mean, it does.
the elements of the Matrix that I just like, eh.
It does have a point of view. It's just like not particularly aimed, right? Like it's a rather broad point of view. It's a kind of a very kind of, freedom is good type of view, right?
Yeah,
Like
that's true.
individual will. And
Yeah, like
individual
it is a
autonomy.
pro-human point of view for certain, right? Like, the villain giving a big monologue about how terrible humanity is,
Yeah,
obviously, that does point that, oh, the Matrix thinks that humanity is good, people living is good, right? But
I mean, but not just living, right? Like obviously the kind of like the people in the pods are alive, right? But they're not really
mhm.
living, right? Like it's like a very kind of like it's very pro free will and very um anti kind of like control in a way which kind of like I think jazzes with the kind of libertarian take that I read in that line, right? It's like no masters type of deal. Um,
Yeah, I mean, and one of the other most interesting lines that I don't think I ever caught before is when Cypher is arguing with Trinity. She says like, like it's a prison, and he's like, "Really? Because I do what Morpheus tells me to do. Is that not a prison?" And I was just like, fuck, dude, like that actually kind of goes harder than like anyone, like that is maybe one of the deepest lines in the whole movie, right? Because it does sort of examine like, are they on the Nebuchadnezzar because of free will? Trinity pulls rank on Neo to make him fall in line, right? Like that's a structure, and it's a structure kind of like the Matrix is a structure, getting people to do what you want. So I don't know, like
yeah, I think that simultaneously kind of like reflects like the kind of I don't know. Like there's obviously a difference in degree, and like Cypher has a point, but only to a point, right? Like, um, but I agree with you. The kind of like the open embrace of like I want to go back into the hole. I want to go back into the box and just feel good and ignore reality, like bury my head in the sand, type
yeah.
of deal.
I mean, and yeah, that's kind of the fucked up part. I actually sort of weirdly empathize with Cypher, and I think in a real situation, I would maybe take the blue pill, just because, like, dude, it looks like it fucking sucks on the Nebuchadnezzar. Like eating that like slop or whatever, they all look so cold and tired. It's just like, man, who wants that, right? Like,
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, this is like approaching from the opposite direction, right? Like if you could plug in and kind of like this is almost in a lot of places like the mirror of like Ready Player One, which does have like some points to like moderation, right? Like the end of the Ready Player One is like and then every Thursday was get out of the simulation day because that's bad, right? Like,
yeah.
um,
No, but that's true because Ready Player One was very like pro the simulation, right?
right,
Like,
yeah, yeah. It's like
one
you
of the
could
core
become
fundamentals of the simulation was that it brought these people together and he found true friendship, you know, online, which I like a lot. I think that that's one of the coolest things in that whole movie. So
yeah,
that's interesting. I didn't think about that.
and I think part of it too is like there's obviously difference in those simulations, right? Like
Yeah.
the
Yeah,
simulation,
that's true. One of the things is that, you spend a lot of time in the early Matrix, in the real world, which I also forgot about, right? Like all of the drama with the bug. I guess I remember the bug, but just like him in his office trying to escape like the agents or whatever, all that stuff. I just kind of like that's the stuff that falls out of the back of your brain, right? Because it's not the super important stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And that does not have a pretty fundamentally good view of like modern society. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it seems to suggest that modern society sucks also, and that's like part of the calculus to break free. Like, you know, if my life in the Matrix sucks and if my life in reality sucks, I would rather take reality just because at least that one is real.
Yeah, yeah. No, I mean, it's interesting too because like it felt like it was also calling up some like sort of like Francis Fukuyama-ish end of history stuff, right? Like 1999, the pinnacle of civilization is like, right in that like towards the end of it's pre 9/11, right? Like the area between like the fall of the Soviet Union and 9/11 is like, again, it's commonly referred to as kind of like the end of history, and then history unends when 9/11 happens, and we go, and the world goes to shit again.
Yeah, worldwide peace is abolished, and we go back into petty conflicts and squabbles.
Yeah. But it's interesting to just to kind of like look at the aesthetics, right? Like obviously they go to like this weird goth club, right? Like, they really torture the Alice in Wonderland metaphor for a while, right? Like just like, it's very much also like an era piece and also like era defining, right? Like,
yeah.
I feel like you can probably draw, like, as horrifying as this is, you could probably draw a straight line from the Matrix to like, the Denver school shooters wearing trench coats, right? Like, it like morphs into kind of like the fedora cool guy, not cool guy, but nerd aesthetic, right? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that there's something about all of that that has only sort of like grown and evolved over time. Like, I think the Matrix, this is probably not a controversial thought thinking about it, but it is like probably one of the most forward thinking movies I can think of from like the 90s or whatever. In terms of just like where we were going and where we were kind of like heading as a society, right? It's very tapped into the internet and to phones and all of this stuff. And like, and this is an interesting thing, right? Like, for instance, in the Matrix Resurrections, which neither of us have seen, we don't know what that's like. Are there landlines that they can use to get out? Because one of the fundamental, like rules of the Matrix is that you need a hard line in order to get out of the Matrix, right? You can talk to your operator on a cell phone, but the cell phone isn't gonna transport you in and out of the Matrix. You need a landline for that. Has that only gotten harder? Because I don't have a fucking landline. Do you?
Nope, absolutely not.
Yeah, like my parents have a landline, I guess, maybe. Like, and actually, that's not even true. I don't think my parents have a landline anymore. I think my parents got rid of their landline. So I don't think I know anybody that has a landline.
My parents do.
Mango's parents have a landline. Neo, if you want to get out of the Matrix, this is my recommendation. Go to fucking Randolph, New Jersey. Can you imagine talking to Dozer? Dozer, I need an escape. All right. There's nothing in Manhattan. You got to get on a train for an hour to Randolph.
You know what I want to know is like, does like a cordless phone like that's hooked into a landline work, right? Does like the I mean that's like a dumb little question, but like
I mean, an interesting one would be would a headset work, right? We are, I'm talking to you through a broadband internet connection, right? Which is obviously what, like, that's a hardwired internet connection. Would that work?
Yeah, no,
probably.
I was gonna say like if I wanted to explain this away, I would say like my cable counts, right? Like my cable service counts, but I don't know, like it'll be interesting seeing how they deal with it. I've also like read earlier, like I've read headlines of early reviews that say something like it's a big subversion, and I am afraid that it's not going to be very good. But we will.
Okay, guys, office buildings still exist. They have lots of landlines. That's fair. I guess office buildings are another good spot for landlines. But I just, in general, like that's something that I was thinking about, right? Like how, even though it is sort of locked in time in a way, right? Because of its place in the zeitgeist. It is pretty, like this is a movie that could have come out in 2010 and I don't think would have been crazy, right? Like, most of the mechanics aren't weird in the same way that like a lot of Seinfeld plots would get solved by cell phones, right? Like we've talked about that kind of an effect before.
Yeah.
But anyway, completely shifting gears because it's my other pet theory that I want to talk about is Agent Smith. So the other thing I love about this movie is Agent Smith, and something I realize is that I feel like Agent Smith is the maybe most fundamental like example of that kind of Thanos archetype of villain, right? Where he gets his villain speech where he says, "I'm a bad guy and this is why," right? And it is because he has some grand misanthropic, hatred of humanity or whatever. And I for some reason, it just really flashed me back to fucking Thanos and I was like, "Oh my god. Thanos is like it's like the domino meme, right? Where it's like Agent Smith explaining to fucking Morpheus how much he hates, humanity, and then the big domino is idiots arguing online on Twitter about whether or not Thanos was right. Like, because I felt like that's sort of what I was watching. And when I was thinking of other movies, like, like the other big 90s movies, um, so for instance, like Independence Day is sort of the other one that was in my head. The aliens are just bad guys. There's nothing more complicated to it than that. They're just fucking bad guys. They're coming to enslave the planet. They don't talk. They don't have any motivation. They're just bad guys, right? Or even like Hans Gruber, right? He's just a thief. He just wants money, man. He just wants to get rich, right? But I feel like almost all of the villains we have nowadays are like these very megalomaniacal, right? Like they have some this greater good thing. They think what they're doing is morally righteous, right? Which I don't know. It's a thing.
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying because I was thinking about like some of this. I think that this might be a cyclical thing. Like we've been talking about how like we're like moving back into like an earnestness,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because like you know Eggman in Sonic is not a complicated is not like a complicated villain, right? Like he, like Jim Carrey hands it up, but he's like very.
This is amazing.
It's like he's a very simple villain, right? Like obviously it's a
Yep.
kids movie, but it's
Yeah.
it's not like I think we're moving back in that direction. I was thinking about what you were
Sure.
saying about like like these little like plot holy type things that you don't pick up on back in 1999. I wonder if like Lost in like the internet or like the turning points for that, where it's like people suddenly have a way to discuss all of their theories with each other, whereas like you could like corner some poor like the meme of like the guy like talking to his girlfriend is like corner some poor person and be like, and I think Oracle's a program. It's like, God, I'm just trying to buy coffee, right? Like
Yeah, I think that this is very real. I absolutely agree with you. And I think that honestly, I think it's bigger than that, right? Like, I think this is the kind of thing that like underwrites everything, right? Like when is the story itself, right? Like what you're talking about versus just kind of like the lore. Like, so for instance, the reason this is in my head is because I'm arguing with people on WoW about it all the time. But there's this like perception that like Shadowlands, like WoW Shadowlands, is not authentically World of Warcraft, right? It is too big, it's too concept, it's too high, like it's too whatever, and it is not the thing that we all agree is World of Warcraft. That's something you'll see on Twitter, you'll see on Reddit or whatever. But when you actually think about it, like the content itself, right? Like Shadowlands is vampires and liches, like the nature spirit, like all of that stuff seems perfectly in keeping with like if I were to tell somebody, is a lich part of World of Warcraft lore? Is an abomination part of World of Warcraft lore, right? Are gargoyles and uh nature spirits, right? Like, are these all things that are part of World of Warcraft lore? You would say yes to each of those individually, but somehow kind of the whole that like the package itself is like doesn't necessarily sort of fit, right? And I think the same thing is kind of true on sort of like a storytelling level because of how we speculate and theorize about this stuff, right? Where we are now sort of looking at the, you know, I'm attacking this like entirely wrong. I'm like making the opposite of the point I want to make here, but whatever. Like, I'm just gonna ride it out, right? So the obsession with these like little tiny details, right, that go in the YouTube videos that make it on like the cinema sins list, actually kind of degrade the overall thing, right? You know, like the overall thing of the Matrix is sort of eaten away by all of like the nitpicky bullshit, until we get to this point where it's like, are we really going to say that like this movie, which is about these bigger philosophical themes about determinism and free will and all of this other stuff, is really undone because like the mechanics of the agents don't quite make as much sense as we might otherwise like think? And the answer to that is like, that's bad. That's something we should be like fighting against, because I think it destroys what makes stories fun and interesting in the first place, right? Is a version of things where the agents snap their finger and delete Neo fun or better than the version of things where they miss with their guns? No, I don't think it is. That's worse, right? So, I don't know. I have complex theories. I have complex
Yeah.
feelings about this shit.
No, I mean it's just one of those things where like, but part of it is but you can and can't help, right? Like, how much like do you unwatch do you like unwatch things where like this is important to like, or like unthink about these things so that like, you don't notice that doesn't make any sense? Do I like, do you like not have to have like an idea of like how game development works, right? Like part of this is probably just that like software dominates our lives so much more than it did back then, right? Like, even like obviously I'm a software professional, you're a software professional, and so we've got a little bit more insight into this thing. I wonder, I feel like even though normies have like a better understanding of like how software works, maybe not to the extent where they'd be able to see these things that we're seeing, but like, you know I wonder how that affects people's abilities to kind of like read into these things, right?
Yeah, I
Um,
also think software itself has changed, right? Like,
yeah,
I mean, what is it Moore's law or whatever? We're 20 years later of processing power getting more like something I talked about earlier, right? Is how effortless an aimbot is in today's ecosystem, right?
right,
Just because the amount of processing power and RAM and all that other stuff, right, that I have at my disposal is so much more powerful than what they would have had at 1999, right? Like there is no there I don't really have to think all that much about limitations of memory or whatever else in order to make these kinds of computational decisions, just because I am submerged in a world where that stuff is pretty freely available. But yeah, in the world of 1999, you can understand how those things would feel, I guess I'm sort of arguing against my own point from earlier, but how those things would feel more real, right? Because connecting to the internet is a slow process. Talking to someone on the internet is a slow process, right? Your computer itself chugs doing basic shit, right? Even on like the most high-end software, because the most high-end software at the time, or on the most high-end hardware, because the most high-end hardware at the time is like 512 megabytes of RAM.
right, yeah. No, man. I wonder, like, if you were to remake like, if you were to, like, pluck Matrix out of time and try and redo it now, right? Like, how it would look, and if you could, like, make it work, or if there was something about, like, at that point in the 90s that kind of, like, made it work. I think,
I think you could do it. I absolutely think you could do it. But you would have to change the world building
yeah,
quite a bit. Not so much the world building, but maybe the rules. Like, so for instance, I could imagine a version of the Matrix where you have some sort of, you kind of have a couple of baseline rules that obfuscate this stuff. For instance, you could say that there's so much traffic going on that it's impossible for the machines, even the most powerful machines or whatever, to monitor all of it, right? That's how you hide people coming in and out of the Matrix, right? And how they have to be alerted to times and locations by all this other stuff and how agents work or whatever. And then you could maybe make a sort of like hacker counter hacker version where you have an operator who is actively hacking the Matrix while the machines are trying to manipulate it. So you have a moment where an agent pops up and Dozer says, I can give you 30 seconds of like a misfiring program that decreases the agent's accuracy or whatever, and so it is now not hitting, or its gun jams or something, right? Like, and you have that sort of like a back and forth, and that just kind of creates the same rules archetype, but you have to you just have to like explain around it a little bit more. I also think you would probably have to change like the phone lines uploading downloading kind of thing, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean,
That doesn't seem crazy to me.
I like the obvious change that everyone talks about, right? Is like originally the people in the pods were supposed to be processing power and not power, right? Like I think you could make that change and like not have people be like the thing was that the rumor is that the studio exec said it has to be power because people don't understand what processing power is.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
You could make
That
that
makes
change,
sense.
and that like also like introduces like a whole avenue of like ways to be like, and because they're processing things, you can't like tell things apart, and that's why people can like jack in or whatever, right? That kind of like And I don't think you need to like. I don't think most of these things need to be explained in the text. Like I think in the meta text maybe, right? Because like none of these things like there's like a level where it's like the reason it doesn't work is because the movie told you so, right? Like the reason
Mhm.
Agent Smith doesn't need to aim or doesn't have perfect aim because the movie showed you that Agent Smith doesn't have perfect aim, right? Like, and you believe the text when it shows it to you. And there's like, you know, you know, obviously places that you can play with that, but like, it's like there must be an explanation that makes sense at some level, right? Like, it's only when it gets like really bad or when like it crosses over into things that can't be can't be real, right? Like the free guy thing we were talking about, like the servers in the basement, right? Like it's being like highly unlikely at the very least, but that's because it's supposed to be like the real world. It's not supposed to be like some magical world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to a certain extent, I almost wonder like how much that like this stuff matters, right? Like this is sort of my other frustration with how we can sometimes talk about movies, right? Like a good example for this is the movie Annihilation. Did you ever see that movie?
I don't think I have.
It is a God, I'm trying to not spoil it. So it's a movie that there's a big alien bubble in the
Yeah,
Florida swamp or
right,
whatever,
right,
right?
right. I remember
Yeah.
the ad.
So there is, like there's like a reveal. They move through the thing, a bunch of weird shit happens, and they eventually figure out why the weird shit happens, right? And the answer basically is that the whole thing is a metaphor for kind of like trauma, right? So it is this metaphor for, like how you aren't the same person that you were when you experience something traumatic. When you go through a traumatic experience, you come out the other side a fundamentally different person with fundamentally different kind of like priorities and understanding of yourself, understanding of the world around you, right? And so this is the metaphor. She goes in to the bubble, a bunch of shit happens, she comes out of the bubble and is the same person. She's in the same body, right? But she is a completely different person, right? That metaphor is entirely lost on this like ecosystem of like lore decoding YouTubers, right? Who are only there to go, oh, when she comes out of the bubble or whatever. And again, I'm trying to spoil. These are all of the story implications. And it's like the story implications don't fucking matter. The story's over, right? Like the story ends, and it ends on her coming out of the bubble and being this, and having changed, right? And speculating on what comes next endlessly is so far beyond the pale. It doesn't matter. It is entirely pointless. But when you can only see sort of the plot level mechanics of the world, and I just want to, see how this world itself kind of functions on a literal level and not deal with it on a thematic level, right? That like that's painful, and that's really harmful. A similar thing, you could make a similar argument about Star Wars. And Star Wars, it's even more insidious because Star Wars lives on, right? So for instance, one of the things that we talked about when it came to The Last Jedi, right? Like what I love, one of the things I love about The Last Jedi is the raw thematic level of it, right? Anybody can be a hero, right? We are what they grow beyond, all of that kind of stuff happening on kind of like a thematic level. But when people are complaining about that movie, a lot of the times what they're complaining about is stuff happening on a literal level, right? Where it is not obeying the rules and the laws of the Star Wars universe as it was written, right? This is why the Holdo maneuver is something that people stick to and are frustrated by, because it just kind of breaks down their understanding of the universe itself, right? It's like how could nobody have thought about this? How could nobody have considered doing this or whatever else, right? And I think that, you know, like that is one way in which people practice criticism, and I would argue a very bad way in which people practice criticism. But it sort of backloads into, you know, like I think that if the Matrix came out today, people would rip it apart for this kind of shit, to be honest.
Yeah, I think people are easier on kind of new properties just because like there's not something to get to contrast against, right? I think you know you know I obviously disagree with you on the Last Jedi, and I think part of that is that like part of what you sign like both parts matter, right? Like the literal level matters at some level, and the thematic level also matters, right? Like I don't
Sure.
want to downplay that. And the problem with like building something in an existing universe is that that literal level like has like set points that matter in a way that you can't break without being untrue to the property, right? Like in Annihilation, again, I haven't seen it, right? Like if there's a thing in that world that doesn't quite match up on the or doesn't quite make sense on the literal level, it doesn't really matter since there will never be a second Annihilation.
Yeah.
Once there is a second Annihilation, or if there ever is, then those are problems for the second Annihilation. It never matters for the first movie, right? It never matters for the thing that um because it is setting that entire scene, right? Like you get a little bit wonky when you're interfacing with the real world, as we've talked about it kind of ad
Yeah,
nauseum in
it
different
is it
places.
is also, you know, in Annihilation, it is a much simpler thing because it is a one-off, right? You know, a YouTuber who is talking about Annihilation and going, this is the implication, the end of the this is the plot level implication for the end of that movie, right? You know, I'm just gonna spoil it because I want to talk about it
You
in
go for
clear
it,
terms. So if you want to not understand what happens in Annihilation, you know, get
leave.
whatever. The thing that happens at the end of Annihilation is she meets the alien, right? That like caused this like bubble disturbance thing or whatever. And the alien turns into a carbon copy of her, right? It becomes a copy of her and then it kills the original, right? And leaves the bubble, right? And the thing that happened is all of these YouTubers were talking about, oh, there's an alien among us. Oh my God, it's not the real her, it's the alien her. Isn't that crazy? But the thing is, without an Annihilation 2, it's not crazy. That doesn't matter. That it's completely superfluous. Who the fuck cares, right? The thing that matters is the thematic level, is that metaphorical level of, right? This is someone who is fundamentally transformed by the trauma that she's experiencing, right? And this whole movie is about how different people cope with their trauma on that thematic metaphorical level. But it does get a little dicey when it comes to the Star Wars universe because like it exists, you know, past that point, right? And oh, there are three. I actually didn't know there were three books. I just knew that there was no sequel because one of the things that was talked about is them not being interested in making a sequel to this movie. Because in the Star Wars universe, like there are, you know, there are sort of there is an expectation that these things will continue on, right? Or maybe, you know, WoW would honestly also be an interesting example of this, right? Like, so something that happened is we got the Night Warrior stuff, we got Tyrande, right? Tyrande becomes the Night Warrior. He's full of all of this power. She fights Sylvanas and is going to kill Sylvanas, but the Night Warrior power gets stripped of her, right? So, and she falls into a coma, right? And that stuff gets resolved later. But you have people who go, what the fuck was the point of the Night Warrior if she didn't kill Sylvanas? If Sylvanas is alive at the beginning of the Night Warrior stuff and at the end of the Night Warrior stuff, why did this matter? It had no effect on the plot. It was superfluous and it was dumb, right? But the Night Warrior stuff is just a literalization of Tyranda's obsession with vengeance, right? She is literally killing herself because she is so fucking obsessed with getting vengeance on Sylvanas, right? It is working on that thematic level. Um, and I just feel like that's like a thing that I am frustrated about when we talk
No,
about
yeah,
this kind of stuff on like a day-to-day, you know, basis, right? I don't think whether or not she is or is not the Night Warrior has a huge implication itself for like you know, the Night Warrior doesn't break any Warcraft rules, right? But when you have someone who is obsessed with the function of like the lore and the universe, it sort of blinds them to these other, kind of levels that a story can be working on. And that happened to be a level that was working on like a character arc level, right?
Right.
Tarande has a character arc where she goes through and she realizes that she doesn't want to, you know, essentially commit fucking suicide, right? And but if all you care about is just like the function of the universe as if it were real, you kind of, I don't know. All of this, well, yeah, this all sounds familiar because I have argued about this with players of players in our raid
I mean, no, I
group.
mean that makes a lot of sense to me, right? Like,
Mhm.
what is the function of saving Mankirk's wife? Did I do the meme right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, what is that? Yeah, definitely.
um, what's but and
And on one
I
hand, I like that. I like that speculative nature, right? To Star Wars, to WoW, to the
yeah,
Matrix, right? I it is a theory of mine that Trinity has the power to choose who the one is, and she chooses Neo. But that's actually, and I could support that with evidence in the text, but that's not like hard fact, right?
right.
Like, there's nothing to make that any more true than Neo is always the one. And he when he makes the decision to stand and fight against Agent Smith, that's when he becomes the one. Or Neo is always the one, and the Oracle lied to him, right, in order to get him into the right place at the right time, in order to try and incentivize him to save or Morpheus's life. Or that Agent Smith is, all of these are different theories, right, that we can kind of speculate about and argue about. And I think that stuff is interesting, right? I mean, we didn't even get to my Agent Smith theory, which is, so people, the common thing that people say about Agent Smith is that when Neo jumps into him, that is what fundamentally changes Smith, right? That Smith takes on some of Neo's abilities and code as the one or whatever, and that's what allows him to return as a villain in Reloaded and Revolutions. But I actually think that that is untrue. um Smith is independent of and motivated by the like out, like, to be outside of the confines of the machine before that happens, right? When he takes the earpiece out and he tells Morpheus that he fucking hates humanity and all he wants is to be free of the Matrix, that's something that happens before Neo jumps into him, and it expresses that he has more consciousness and free will than any of the other machines like do or exhibit. And he has a different goal than those machines do, right? Like, he is essentially working with the machines because he believes that they're a means to an end. And so, you know, I think Smith is just transformed by his hatred, right? He is transformed by his fundamental loathing of humanity. And Neo is incidental to that whole process. But again, that's a theory. That's just a theory, right? A Matrix theory. And it's cool to argue about that sort of stuff, but I don't know. I also just like feel like it's only cool to argue about that stuff when it's like bigger and more complex than just how does X plus Y equals Z.
Yeah, I mean, I will agree with you to a certain extent. There's been an over literalization of a lot of this stuff. Um, I think we could, we've talked about it plenty on the show in various times. Um, but I just don't think that means that it's not important at all, right?
Yeah.
Things swing back and forth. Like I said, I think at some point we're due for like a reversion to the meme mean, right? Like, just because like we've gone so far down that path that, like, I don't know. I also think it's easier to do with things that, like, I think sci-fi is a hard genre to be less literal with, because, like, I think that's part of like what the draw of sci-fi is, right? Is like
Mhm.
these kind of like worlds that you can explore and like deign to have internal consistency, right? Like that's part of the draw of it. And I think there are ways to explore like these kind of like lofty, like these thematic things in other ways that don't necessarily have to have the grounding and the literalness to like kind of like pull
Yeah,
those
something
directions.
that I also forgot about when it came to the Matrix is how much of this movie is just explaining the raw function of the Matrix, the world, the
Yeah.
machines, and all of that stuff, right? Like, there's a very long first act, like maybe the first half is like act one of the Matrix, right? Because there's just a lot of conversations that are just explaining the function of the world, right? Where Morpheus is going, well, you can make a 25,000 BTUs with a human, or whatever, right? And that's not a burden that is on a movie like Die Hard or something like that, you know what I mean? Which is just essentially taking place in the contemporary world as we know it, right? You don't really have to explain the setting at all. But I do think that is like a legitimate part of the draw, right? Like there are good settings and bad settings, I guess I would say. And I've definitely had that interaction where, you know, like all of the dystopian YA movies are sort of like this, like the Hunger Games. Really, the Hunger Games setting and those sorts of settings in those like post, apocalypse, like those dystopian YA kind of movies, they tend to be pretty bland and uninteresting, and I don't really know I'm not really gripped or am interested by the rules of them all that much. And I think that that's like a real sort of it's something that tends to be dropped by the wayside. Actually, maybe a more topical version of this is Cyberpunk 2077, which is, I talked about it not giving me that Skyrim feeling. And the thing I think I'm describing in it not giving me that Skyrim feeling is this like world that I want to go sort of submerge and immerse myself in, right? Where it's not really selling me on the setting itself being an interesting or compelling place that I want to spend a lot of time going and exploring and learning all about, if that makes sense.
It does.
Which is maybe did you ever or do you want to segue? Should we do we can do final thoughts as well.
Yeah, I guess that's probably the right place to do it. Yeah, so final thoughts. I don't know if I get anything more about The Matrix. It's a good movie. If you haven't seen it.
It's a very good movie. Is it can I ask, is it your favorite Matrix movie?
No.
Oh, yeah, boy, let's get it. Damn. Yeah, I definitely think it is the best of the Matrix movies, but it is also not my favorite Matrix movie.
Yeah, I really like Reloaded. It's very cerebral. Although I haven't watched it in a while, so we'll talk about that next week.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that next week, I guess.
How was your week?
Well, speaking of Skyrim, I started playing Skyrim again over the Thanksgiving break, and I played like 15 hours of Skyrim in 4 days. Because my initial question was, and the Skyrim Anniversary Edition just came out, which is why it was on my mind. But the initial question was, if I am looking for that Skyrim feeling, can I get it from Skyrim, or like is it too elusive, right? Friend of the cast Zhao asked in one of the chats where if Cyberpunk was good, and I just sort of mentally compared it in my head to some of the recent sort of like open world games I've played, and the answer is kind of not really, right? Like I think I like Cyberpunk 2077 less than I liked like Assassin's Creed Valhalla, for instance, or Far Cry New Dawn, which I played pretty recently. And I'm just trying to like unpack that. Like I feel like I'm saying Cyberpunk is not a good game, but I also don't want to say that. And so I'm just sort of feeling around for this. But the answer is yes, Skyrim absolutely is just as fucking like, it's so easy to get sucked into that game. It's so easy to get just like right up into it. And one of the neat things from the Anniversary Edition is they added a survival mode. This is also part of what was fun. Is survival mode was something from Fallout New Vegas, where you have a hunger meter, you have to drink water, you have to sleep, or you'll it just kind of overall makes the experience like more fundamentally realistic. Skyrim also has a survival mode now. Maybe the big one is no fast travel, right? And it's just been great. It's just been a treat. There's so much little shit in that game that I completely fucking forgot about, which is crazy because I've put like 300 or 400 hours probably over the course of the last 10 years into this game. But like I just kept running into stuff. I was like, oh shit, I remember this quest, but I also don't. Like I remember the introduction where somebody said, oh, this person is whatever, right? But I was like, what actually happens? I guess I don't remember. So yeah.
Yeah, very cool. Very cool.
Did you end up finishing Cyberpunk?
I have not yet.
Okay.
I got to I started chaining through a side quest that seemed really interesting, so I've been like biding my time. And then I I could not play while I was home for Thanksgiving.
Oh,
Um,
sure, because you were on your laptop.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I really just need to bite the bullet and finish it off. I have gotten to this point where, I don't know, maybe I just like should up the difficulty or something, or I should just play it like a stealth game. I'm just playing it like an action game, and I just run up and left click things and they die, or I die. And that's it. That's like it is
Yeah,
no more complex or interesting than that.
I feel like that's like how a lot of combat played out in like Skyrim, though, right? Like, it's there's just like a limit to how complex you can make open world games, like the combat in open world games, and still have it like function. Um,
Yeah, that's
at
definitely
least
true.
for the
I
time
yeah,
being.
I think that is fundamentally true. And there's an interesting tension, right? Because like, so one of the things they said is to play it like a stealth game or whatever. And like that's the thing that happens in Skyrim. People play stealth archer, right? And I was sort of wonder, is that sort of a like an indication that the straight up fighting mechanics are just like not that fun, not that interesting, not that kind of complex or whatever. I do think there's something to sort of like the resource management of it all, right? And this is maybe the thing that Skyrim has, it like hooks me with in a way that Cyberpunk doesn't. Like I don't really care about money, and I'm not thinking about my inventory or anything at all. It's just kind of like when I get stuff, I essentially, I disassemble it or whatever. And then when I have a certain amount of money, I go buy I go to a Ripper Doc and I buy some upgrade. But like in Skyrim, I'm constantly thinking about, right, like my encumbrance, right? Oh, I'm in a dungeon and I have 150 carrying capacity. What can I pull out of that dungeon that's the most valuable stuff? And I want to use that money to then, craft weapons or like buy a house or whatever else, right? Like there's all these kinds of ancillary sort of secondary objectives to it that make a sort of like a web of incentives to the play, if that makes sense.
It does. Um, yeah.
But yeah, I need to like buckle down and actually just finish, so because I'm on the quest. I'm at the point where it's like, don't go any further. If you're about to
Yeah, yeah.
end the fucking game, and there's a side quest that I'm just pretty sure I want to complete, mostly because I have a feeling it's going to change the ending to the good ending, and so that's why I'm doing it. That's like
Fair
the only
enough.
reason.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm similarly doing some side quests in that vein. Although I haven't played in like but I played a bunch of Halo over the break because I was at home. My brother brought his Xbox home as well. I found out that you can plug a mouse and keyboard into an Xbox One and they work. So I didn't have to play Halo with a controller. I played for like a match with it. I was like, I can't do this. It feels so sloppy. Um, but that's
Hacks.
um, and Halo is fun. I played the event, which gets you like samurai looking armor. It's neat. Um, but it's Halo, baby. Um, I also played a handful of Carrion, which is like a reverse Metroid in that you play the monster and you're like zipping through stuff. You're like solving puzzles. It's a relatively short game. I didn't finish it yet, but I can tell I'm like almost at the end. Um, that was neat. It's on Xbox Game Pass, so it's also on PC for Ultimate Game Pass. But and then the other big thing I did is I watched all of Squid Game with my brother. Um, and it starts out strong, and I think it ends really weak. Like I don't understand how this blew up so much because like I think the ending is like not great. Um,
Oh, okay. I actually also don't understand how it blew up so much, but I haven't watched it, so.
I mean, funnily enough, it kind of like you talk about these like YA post-apocalyptic settings. It's like in kind of the the what's the word the battle royale genre, right? Like it, and the world building aspects are neat, but like I said, it kind of falls off towards the end. And so one of the things that I thought was super interesting, just from kind of like a general perspective, is like my brother and I would sit there and we talk about it. We make like predictions for the next episode, like next minute or whatever. And you could tell that we were coming from a very American context, because like the next thing would happen and it'd be like not what we predicted and be a lot more earnest, basically, than what we were
Mhm.
predicting. Like we predict something like vaguely cynical, right? Like like, and this is a very mild spoiler for Squid Game. But in the second episode, at the top of the second episode, they do the kind of like, and if half of like one of the things they explain about the Squid Game is that the third clause is that the games can end if by a majority vote, um, everybody agrees to quit the games, right? Or like if a majority want to quit the games and the games end, right? And like I think it's either bottom of the first episode or top of the second episode, they call one of these votes. I'm like, oh, obviously it's gonna fail, um, and it's gonna be a plot point later. The vote succeeds, and they all go home. And there's like a further stuff that happens, right? Like obviously the games continue at some point in the future, but I was just like, oh, I was not expecting that, right? Like, and there's also further implications down the line.
That
For
happens to me in anime actually quite commonly, where I think I know where something is going, but like I don't understand the anime trope. I understand
yeah,
it's kind of like mirror like Western counterpart trope. This
right,
happened specifically in My Hero Academia is what I'm thinking of. Because like I mean I don't know maybe we haven't done the more recent seasons. I could be misunderstanding the stuff, right? But it just seemed that like some of the stuff they were setting up and paying off with like the villains and like the heroes, like I just had expectations that were like, oh, I think XYZ, but that just comes from my understanding as like a Western comics reader, not like a shonen jump reader, right?
right, right, right.
And I would have seen it coming kind of like from the other direction. But that's interesting. I have not watched Squid Game, and I've also just like resisted the temptation, I guess. There was a while where I was like, I want to be part of the cultural conversation. There's sometimes when I just like watch it for those reasons, but I don't know. The three shows I've been watching in no particular like sort of order, but I just keep rotating between them for some reason is American Dad, because I don't know. That show's great. It just is really fucking funny. Honestly, the reason is because I made a reference to it in my with my Mythics team, and I was like, man, that show's good. I haven't watched it in a while, and so I've just like started putting it on the background while I'm doing like WoW stuff or whatever. Arrested Development, which I only started watching because I also started watching Succession, the HBO show. And Succession immediately gave me Arrested Development vibes. And I was like, I'm going to watch these two back like side by side and see what that's like. Because obviously, Arrested Development is the story, it is the, humorous screwball comedy story of a family of rich idiots. And Succession is the incredibly serious, dramatic story about a family of rich idiots. Well, maybe less idiots, more just like fucking like assholes. Something I remember. I once reviewed Transparent on the podcast, and I said that I hated that show because everyone in it was absolutely terrible, but the show kept insisting that I should like them and that they were like, they were good people trying their best. And I was like, no, these guys are all terrible human beings, and I hate every single one of them. Succession is that version of the show, but like it understands that all of these people fucking suck. They are the worst, and I just categorically cannot empathize with a single one of them. I only have loathing and contempt for every single one of these.
All right, fair enough.
That's it.
Uh,
That's my thoughts so far. I'm only 6 episodes in, so we'll see how far this goes. But boy, it's motivating to just watch a movie out of Schadenfreude because I hate everyone on screen, and I just like watching them suffer. I just want whoever is winning in their games fighting each other. I want that person to just inflict as much emotional harm on all of these other people because they all are so terrible and I hate them so much. So yeah, I would recommend watching Succession just because I don't know. It's good. It's an HBO show. It reminds me like of a lot of other HBO shows. But yeah.
yeah, um, that's fair.
Lou
I
says in the chat, I would trade Squid Game for the next season of Alice in Borderland. Trade that earnestness and indictment of capitalism for fantasy and Saw. Please don't make me remember how much the real world sucks. I don't understand what that means because I don't know either of these shows
so
well enough at all. But
so I mean, this is only a mild spoiler. The reason the games continue is because basically everybody realizes that their life sucks more than playing the Squid Game, so they go play the Squid Game. Or
Wow.
basically it's something like 20 something people don't come back, but everybody else does. And I might quibble with the argument there, because like all the people that are in the Squid Game have like made really poor life decisions, right? Like they make it very clear that no one in this game is there just because everything's fucked, right? Like maybe one character who's like a North Korean refugee, and also Ali. There is one of the characters is a Pakistani migrant worker who kind of like just doesn't get paid by his boss and has to. It's a whole thing. So maybe that's a little bit more fair than I'm giving it credit for. But like almost all the people there are like not like are like fuck ups, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
In one way or another. But and it's like it is interesting, but like I said, I don't think it lands it. I don't think it sticks to landing very well. Um, but I have not seen Alice in Borderlands. I have heard mixed things about it.
I really, really don't want to get into spoilers, but I think the anti-capitalism shit is more in the sponsors than the contestants, though the
Yeah,
contestants have a version of it.
yeah. No,
Okay.
no. There is. I mean, it's yeah. I get that, Lou. That's definitely fair. But anyway, moving on to other things. I've started Heretics of Dune, the fifth book.
Whoa.
Things have gotten weirder, which is like um, it's as I'm going through it, it's kind of like I think like 4 was definitely like, and Frank Herbert's weird musings on politics, and 5 feels like it's going to be Frank Herbert's weird musings on religion. Um, there's some things I don't like about it already, like everything has always been like very allegorical, but like they like in the beginning of the 5th book, they like reveal that the one faction, the Clayloxu, are the literal continuation of like Sunni and Sufi Muslims in like it like kind of makes sense, maybe, but like nothing's been this direct since, or I mean there's been some stuff, right? Like they talk about Hitler and at some point, but like it's just like weird how direct it is. I don't know.
That's
It's
crazy. Honestly, that's kind of nuts.
yeah. Um I don't know. And there's a lot more context that you have to read through 4 books to understand, but it also raises some questions about the second book. Um but I'm marching through that. What else have I done? I don't know. Oh, this thing I've talked about periodically, 8-bit Brody, the Antilympics. Um, I've talked. So it's basically like 8-bit Brody is a guy who does convention, like he goes to like video game conventions and like dresses like a used car salesman and asks people like vaguely obnoxious questions. And it's entertaining, right? But obviously during the pandemic, he couldn't do that, right? So he for a while he just had people do guest videos. I think like what happens is like I'll just have people do guest videos until the pandemic's over, and like at some point that wasn't tenable anymore, right? So we started doing this like long form piece of content that was like revealed in like short 3-minute segments for like over a year, and it finally concluded. So you can go watch all of that, and it's like not the greatest thing in the world, but it was super fun to watch for a year, and I'm excited to see what happens next with the channel. Maybe he'll start going to conventions again.
Nice. That reminds me of the Patrick H. Williams season. I was telling somebody about that. I feel like the pandemic has honestly been pretty good for YouTubers. I feel like a lot of YouTubers have put out really strong content in the pandemic itself. Even if, I'm actually a little bummed. Some of my favorite YouTubers haven't actually done much, but
Yeah,
those that have done good shit, IMO.
yeah. Otherwise, oh, so I watched a really interesting video on let me see if I can find it. It's by, I think the channel's named Ahoy. And he usually does kind of like breakdowns of like video game weapons. Um and being like, like the real history behind the real gun that backs it up. But this one, he did a video on, what is it? On like basically, I'm using the wrong term. It's like chip.
Crackers?
Yeah, chiptune software, essentially. Like
Interesting.
the history of it, and I like kind of in the same way that like you watch like uh a video like a was it Summoning Solve that does the speedrunning videos,
Sure.
but like on like a piece of real technology and how things work. And the graphics are always really pretty, and he goes through some details on it, and I thought it was interesting.
This is a neat channel. This is a very cool
It is
channel
a
I've
very
never
cool
seen
channel. I
before.
recommend it to everyone. But that came out over the break, as did the new Seth Tazinch video, which is always fun. They're always fun to watch.
Yeah, my obsession for a while was, have you ever seen this genre of expert reacts to movies, in their genre, and they point out all the things. It's like, oh, I'm Chris Hadfield, I'm a real astronaut, and I'm gonna like
Yeah.
nitpick all the space movies or whatever. There was a while where I was addicted to I was just watching every single one of those I could fucking find. This is like that kind of video.
So
I
it's
feel like.
really funny. That is another thing I managed to find is a channel I watch is Forgotten Weapons, which is basically a historical firearms channel.
Okay.
And IGN called him in to like talk about AK-47s in video games. And so like there's like a
Whoa.
30 or 40-minute video of him like talking about maybe it's not that long. Maybe but sometimes his videos get long, but like it's like a bunch of videos of him talking about like what's up with like how accurate the different portrayals in video games are of AK-47s in particular. It was I don't know. I thought it was interesting. I thought it was I'm into that kind of thing. But it's very much in that genre of like expert reacts type of deal.
Sure. Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's about it.
Yeah. Well, if you've got anything you'd like to or if you have opinions on the Matrix you'd like to share with us, or any of the other things you talked about in the podcast, you reach us at dirtplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@dirtplaygames.com. Rate, review us on everywhere the podcasts are. Do all the things. Very importantly, we are fast approaching the episode number 300.
Very true.
We are, based on timing, we're probably going to do an extra episode that is episode 300 because it should fall between either Reloaded and Resurrection, or no, Revelations and Resurrection, between either the second and third or the third and fourth Matrix movies. And so we want to get that out there in correct episode order. So send us your questions. It's today a May style thing. Traditionally, we have just gone until we've run out of questions to ask. So please send us your questions. Again, that's podcast at subdirtplaygames.com or subdirtplaygames@gmail.com. I believe the first time we did it, we went for like 5 hours. The second time was much more reasonable. But send us your questions. We'd love to answer them. And you can send us questions whenever, but we usually manage to actually get people to
time to send us questions.
Yeah.
Because we will answer every single question we get. We always make that commitment.
Yeah. No matter how long it takes. That's everything I have. But do you have anything else you want to promote?
I am streaming this Friday. I'm doing a stream for Cardboard Kings for Games Gathering Kiev. But it's at the same time, normal 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on the twitch.tv/Akbar Games channel. And I guess that's the only thing I wanted to promote. So yeah.
Right. Well, in that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.